Hi everyone, thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Natalie, a film programmer at the Asian Film Archive. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for the discussion Reorienting Orientalism in Cinema as part of the Orienting Paradise Western Projections of the East program running until 29th April. Curated in response to the Mapping the World Perspectives from Asian Cartography exhibition at the National Library, this program of 9 films, many of which are considered canonical, include musicals such as Walter Lang's 1956 The King and I, travelogues such as Chris Marker's Sans Soleil and Sunday in Peking, and historical epics including Bernardo Bertolucci's The Last Emperor. Across paradisal landscapes of the lush tropics and rugged highlands, this program frames cinema as a cartographic act, shaped to different degrees by transnational desires, Orientalist attitudes, and forms of Western imperialism. While the map aims to be a spatial representation of reality based on claims to scientific rationalism, the cartographic film is charged with seductive visions of the so-called other through narratives of adventure, discovery, and moral panic in the East. The panel aims to provide context to the films, which can be understood as part of the colonial apparatus and contain historically inaccurate depictions of Asia. Rather than ignore or erase these histories, the films and their complex legacies provide opportunities to be critically viewed, contextualized, and discussed. So, what is an Asian accent and how was it shaped in these films? How does going native trivialize relations of power and inequality? And why the obsession over harems? As the panelists navigate the oriental tropes of these classic films and perhaps reorient us to consider their subversive potentials, please feel free to ask questions throughout the duration of the discussion, which will be addressed by the panelists during the question and answer later. So now that I've given a bit of an introduction to the program, I'm very pleased to introduce our speakers and moderator for this evening's discussion. So first up, we have moderator Faris Juraimi.
Hi.
Yeah, Faris is a history graduate from Yale and US College. A writer and researcher specializing in the history of the Malay world, he has authored various essays for print and electronic media. He also co-edited Raffles Renowned Towards a Merdeka History together with Sai Siu Min and Alfian Saad. He begins his PhD studies at NYU later this year. And now on to our panelists. We have Sandeep Ray, our first panelist, who is a writer, visual artist, and historian. He is the Senior Lecturer of Southeast Asian History at the Singapore University of Technology and Design, where he also heads the non-fiction film lab. With a filmmaking background, he has produced a diverse body of non-fiction films in Kolkata, Java, and Greece, amongst others. His documentaries have been reviewed in the American Anthropologist, screened at festivals including Busan, Taiwan, Copenhagen Docs, and exhibited at the Whitney and Getty Museums. He's the author of A Flatten the Colony and Celluloid Colony. Thank you. And also we have our second panelist, Olivia Khoo, and professor in film and screen studies at Monash University. She's the author of Asian Cinema, A Regional View, and The Chinese Exotic, Modern Diasporic Femininity, which examines new representations of diasporic Chinese femininity emerging from Asia-Pacific modernity since the late 20th century. So thank you all for joining us this evening, and I'll let Faris take the conversation.
Thanks, Natalie, for that introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us on this Thursday evening. It's great to have you all here. We have about 40 minutes for a conversation with Sandeep and Olivia, and then after that proceed to the Q&A for about 20 minutes. So. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay,
Sorry, we're just
all right. So let's, yeah, there's a technical. Should I start again from the beginning? Okay, sorry everyone, sorry for that technical interruption. Thanks for joining us on this Thursday evening. I'll just start with, we don't really have a sequence for either Sandeep or Olivia starting first, so how this works is that I'll go in with a few questions, and whoever has thoughts can just feel free to jump in, right? And then, so this will go on for about 40 minutes, and then we'll go into Q&A for 20 minutes. So let's start with the category of Orientalism itself. It seems apparent that many of the films in the AFA program have what's commonly conventionally understood as Orientalist tropes, right? So we see the fetishization of the landscape and the culture. We have a kind of aesthetics of excess in the costumes and set. But we also see instances in which some of these films subvert imperialism and its gaze. So maybe we can talk first about how these films challenge or expand our understanding of Orientalism, quote unquote, as a genre. So Sandeep or Olivia, if you have any thoughts or comments, please feel free.
Should I go first, Olivia? Is that okay? Okay. So, you know, I think we use the term Orientalism as a catch-all phrase for so many things. It's a real favorite word in academia, right? But every context is different. Every body of work is different. And within a body of work, there could be, if there was some kind of a meter, it could sway towards, you know, Orientalism, and then it could sway back to something that's, you know, a bit more acceptable if we're thinking of Orientalism as something that's disturbing, which it is, of course. So there are a variety of films in this program, and I think our viewers might have watched some of them, or hopefully most of them, and they really run the gamut, right? So I'll pick on a couple that I thought were quite different compared to most of the other films. So something like The Lawrence of Arabia is not difficult to pick apart for its Orientalist excesses in imagery. But if you look at a film like Sunday in Peking, a short film, now this film is actually anything but Orientalist. You know, it's the 1950s. It's after the West, quote unquote, lost China to the communists, and they have these terrible ideas about what that could be. We see some of those impressions in Shanghai Express, right? Those fears. And in this film, you have a French filmmaker who's saying, no, you really have to think about China in a different way. And I don't read much Orientalism in this kind of work. I mean, if you're in the 50s walking around with the camera and you film things, it looks Orientalist to us today, even to us, okay? So I think that film was quite all right. Black Narcissus, okay? It is pregnant with all those quote unquote flaws of Orientalism. It's set up that way. The natives and the local people are, you know, talked upon as illiterate children, and they're looked down upon, and we have these missionaries who are there to save them. It's got quote unquote brown face operating and everything else. But if you look at the message of the film, or the sort of the central driving theme of the film, it's that these misconceptions were held by the British who were there. It's almost as though the film does that to explain the misconceptions. And it's, you know, it's 1947. They've just lost India or given up India, however you want to look at it. And they're out the door and they've failed. They've gone up the mountain, have gone down the mountain. And so while it falls within, you know, some spectrum of being Orientalism, I think the larger picture is a little different. Hiroshima Mon Amour also is an example of something that I think tries to straddle a line between looking at Europe and the experiences there, and looking at what happened in Japan. Although I wouldn't let that film off that lightly. There's some more complexities to it, but I'll let Olivia say a few things.
No, Sandeep, I think that's really great. That you're right. We sort of need to look at them individually to see how they are. And we can look at them as a category as participating in Orientalism, but I think they are actually, some of them are quite complex for the time that they were made, and also historically, how we're looking at them today is going to be very different from how audiences might have perceived them and sort of accepted them from the 40s or 50s or 60s. I was just thinking how the films are very much kind of lauded in our canon, that they are films that we take up and kind of continue to talk about for as kind of pioneers in different ways of film form and aesthetics. So we look at The River as being this kind of, amazing kind of Technicolor achievement. By Renoir, we think about Hiroshima, Mon Amour, and Chris Marker's films as, representing the kind of French New Wave. So they're sort of pushing these aesthetic boundaries for us in different ways. But I was sort of interested in how much of that is linked to the fact that we think of them as Orientalist films. So I guess I just mean, is the form of the film, the kind of the aesthetics of it and its Orientalism part of how we perceive the films as being in a canon that we should be interested in archiving and watching? So I don't know whether that means that we are challenging the idea of Orientalism through their other kind of formal advancements, or whether the Orientalism is part of that. I guess that's just how I was thinking of that answer, that question that you posed. It's not really answering it, but I am interested in how, we do think about these films as being so, forward in certain ways, but backwards in their thinking, maybe. Yeah.
Right. No, that's a very interesting point. I mean, thinking through form, because in the 19th century, Orientalism was also predominantly referring to a specific genre of salon painting in France, right? So it was kind of closely associated with a tradition of visual representation pretty early on, before Said kind of conceptualized it, in this kind of discursive, with this more discursive definition. And so, and in that kind of context, it was seen as, a pretty conservative kind of, style, because it was conforming to the academic style of painting. But here with cinema, like you mentioned, they're doing new things. They're pushing new frontiers in kind of, stylistic, forms of cinematic representation. So that's, thank you. That's a really good point. So, and sticking to the theme of medium, right? Many of these films were adaptations, right, of European memoirs. So Black Narcissus was, based on an account, a written account. King and I was also written by Anna Leon Owens first, and then adapted by Oscar and Hammerstein, and then made into a film. In The Last Emperor, the book that Reginald Johnston himself wrote, based on his experiences in the Forbidden City, are featured in the movie itself. So, I mean, do you feel like the medium of film kind of reinforces the authority of these Western observers, or do you think they kind of subvert them or cause them to recede into the background? Because when you read a memoir, you're kind of really looking at it through the gaze of the narrator, and with cinema, it's obviously a different thing, right? So, what are your thoughts on that?
I guess at a very basic level, cinema really condenses quite a lot of material that you'd get in a memoir into something that's generally quite short, unless it's The Last Emperor, but that it's usually 1.5, 2 hours, and so what you do get tends to be all of the stereotypes become heightened in a way, and they do have to kind of cut down a lot of information and distill it into these sort of types or forms that people might be familiar with. So on one level, just the adaptation to cinema will, I think, reinforce certain kind of Orientalist tropes. At the same time, the memoir is very individualistic and a kind of a personal account of something. But once you do open it up to cinema, which becomes a more sort of democratic form in a way, they can be told from a different perspective. Audiences can read them in different ways. So in some ways, maybe it does, as you say, kind of neutralize, or I don't know, opens it up to different interpretations anyway.
Yeah. Right. Sandeep, do you have any thoughts? Your mic is.
Yeah, here we go. Yes, I agree completely that it's about the adaptation, and adaptations could be different. I mean, even if you're distilling it down to 1.5 hours, how much of the original thrust of the story of the memoir are you keeping? So, for example, in The King and I, we do know that it was based on a memoir. But even if we look it up on Wikipedia or something, we do know that a lot of that memoir was suspect. But then the governess or the English teacher, she actually was an abolitionist. You could say that she might have had something to do with some of the ideas that were propagated at the time in the royal court. Right. So again, it depends on how much of it you might be adapting. The River and The Black Narcissus, both written by the same author, both don't seem to have altered very much in the film, at least in the essence in which it was written. I mean, these were both very slim novels, right? So I don't think they left too much out, and I don't think it seems like anyone reading the novels wouldn't find them to be too different from what the films were supposed to make, which is a little surprising given that this woman actually had lived in that part of the world with her sister and then had written about that experience. Hiroshima Mon Amour, Margaret Dura, and I hope I'm not butchering the pronunciation, was actually part of the screenwriting team, right? And she was asked, people critique the films on various levels. I mean, it is a very, very famous film. And some people said that the character, the Japanese architect, was not very Japanese. He was a very, Western-looking man, right? And her response to that was, she didn't want people to think that that's an attractive Japanese, but that's an attractive man. So you could say that disturbing part of it, which a lot of people didn't like, came from the author. And in that case, it is a pure, clean-cut case of reinforcing that adaptation on the screen again.
Right. That's very interesting. I mean, this idea that kind of in trying to humanize, this Asian character, they still have to be seen as somewhat adjacent to European standards of what's attractive. I'm reminded of the character Auda from Jules Verne's Around the World in 80 Days. I mean, she was seen as worth saving because she had like European features, even though she was from Hindustan. So yeah, that's a very interesting point. Olivia, do you have any comments?
No, I'm just thinking of Anna May Wong actually as well, and her character in Shanghai Express being sort of half Asian, I think, and how she's also made to these fallen women, that they were going to be recuperated in some way, or so I am just trying to think about. You're right that they are about standards of what is an acceptable Asian, or the ones that get to live or be saved, and the ones that get sacrificed. A lot of the time in these films, comes down to certain ideals that we have of, being the right kind of Asian, I suppose. Yeah,
I think we're seeing that in the world right now. I mean, there's there are several horrific situations in the world going on, and there seems to be a tendency. People seem to want to save some people over other people. I'm not saying that everyone shouldn't be saved, but this hasn't gone away.
Right. Yeah, who is worth saving, and who is worth civilizing? I mean, these are also questions that the films raise, and the trope of tutelage comes out a lot as well in these films. I mean, King and I. And Last Emperor. I mean, the figure of the European in the court, kind of educating the ruler, kind of establishes that hierarchy. Whereas, I mean, historically, if you think about it, these were pretty progressive courts. I mean, kind of trying to self-reform and modernize and so on and so forth. let's talk a little bit about gender, because that's obviously a huge theme in Orientalist representation across media, not just cinema. And in these films, I mean, we see women playing very specific functions in Orientalist in the story. I mean, as intrepid travelers, or harem women, or concubines. What are some of the ways these films kind of displace European anxieties about gender onto the imagined East, do you think?
I was thinking about the program in the Orienting Paradise program, and I think all of the films are directed by men. Is that right? I was just doing my quick count, but I think they are. So there is a very specific set of male gazers, I think, that are involved. And you're right, that idea of tutelage or just sort of pedagogy is in Black Narcissus as well, just that idea of teaching and learning. But coming back, I mean, Natalie opened this program and talked about how we have certain kinds of I'm thinking about the anxieties, but there's anxieties about Asia, but there's also those kind of things that people find exciting or exotic about the Orient. And part of that is the idea of adventure and risk. And, I think the women sort of tend to embody that. So, in different ways, there's sort of both fear and desire displaced onto the Orient, or the figure of the Orient, whether that's a person or a place. So you certainly get Anna May Wong again, she kind of represents this, she's always the kind of dragon lady. She's exciting, but at the same time dangerous, and she is the kind of foil to Marlene Dietrich's Shanghai Lily. So again, the Orient is kind of in some ways, at least by name, displaced onto Dietrich's figure. But in most of the examples in this program anyway, and this is a different conversation, is that it's a relationship between a Western woman and a sort of Oriental, quote, or Asian man, which is a very different kind of relationship than if it was an Asian woman and a white man. There's just very different set of desires and projections placed onto men from Asia as opposed to women, I think. So, I mean, maybe Sandeep has more specific comments about that.
No, I completely agree with you. Yes, all the films, before a certain time, I guess all films, mostly anywhere, would have been made by men. I mean, it's changing slowly. I mean, it hasn't balanced out quite yet, but certainly not in this period that we're looking at. I'm just going to push it a little bit and say that I think that maybe some of the directors in this film took this different landscape where they were making the movies to actually experiment on certain things or give women certain roles. For example, the tutor in The King and I, right? Now, who starts consulting with the king about affairs of state. It would not have been possible in 1860s England, but maybe in Asia, you could create a situation where a woman could do that. The first female medical graduate from the empire was from Calcutta, because they tried it out in Calcutta first and said, what happens if we admit a woman into medical school, before someone graduated as a doctor from England. Another place where this kind of thing may have been a bit of a push is a film like Shanghai Express, whose overall moral story or concept of a story I just don't really like very much. But you have this, you have Shanghai Lily, a prostitute, who in the end actually scores a moral victory or sort of takes on a moral depth that might have been difficult to have had she not been in Asia, where things are different. And men and women all behave differently. And maybe they were able to give her, sort of a moral pedestal because it was a film shot in Asia. Probably it wouldn't have been so easy for a huge studio film in Hollywood to have done that. I'm not sure about this. I haven't done my research, but it's just a sense I have from that film.
Right. No, that's very interesting. I mean, it plays into the idea of Asia as a space of kind of possibility and laxity, because these bourgeois standards in Europe aren't allowing, for example, women to transgress certain boundaries, which is in the 19th century there were also kind of people responding to the trope of the harem by saying, well, bourgeois women in Paris aren't exactly that free either. They were also living under a very patriarchal, kind of system. So, building on that, how does queerness feature as an exploration of these boundaries of desire, intimacy, and gender roles? You see that, Shanghai Express is pretty, it's pretty queer. We've got Anna May Wong and Marlene Dietrich kind of, as almost like item in the film. What do you think, Olivia?
Well, I guess, yeah, if we think about Orientalism as being about power relationships between, a hierarchical relationship between the West and the East, or between different races, then certainly when it comes and you're adding gender to that and gendered relationships, they are, relationships between men and women, white men and Asian women, or the other way around, tends to have a certain another level of power kind of embedded into them. But I think in terms of queer relationships, and this is again a very broad generalization, it seems to be a more equalizing way of addressing certain relationships between people. And again, this Asia as a site of freedom to explore different things is another trope that we see in a lot of these kinds of films. So in some ways, I think queer relationships allow filmmakers to explore desire and intimacy in a freer way that they can express without the additional constraints of gendered and racial hierarchies.
Mm-hmm. But even then, even in that freedom, it's also whiteness that enables Asia to become the white person's sort of playground, right? Because they're not subject to a lot of pressures in these societies, right?
Yeah, absolutely. No, you're absolutely right, and I think that's how the French were sort of imagined Asia, that it was this site of new exploration, both kind of for their formal explorations in cinema or in writing, that it allowed them to escape the sort of boring old conventions that they were having to deal with in France, and that they saw this as a kind of amazing new site of exploration and adventure, and through that as well, part of that was sexual, exploration through sexual relationships as well, either kind of through queer relationships or kind of reconfigured sort of racial relationships. So yeah, it's a marker of white privilege that you can see another place as offering you that kind of freedom, because you only have that freedom because it already exists. You're just displacing it somewhere else. Yeah,
absolutely. And so yeah, Sandeep, do you have anything to add?
I was just going to touch on Lawrence of Arabia. My God, right? The guy was apparently Peter O'Toole is a foot taller and a hunk compared to the original Lawrence of Arabia. Okay, he picked a good-looking guy for an actor, but there's a lot more to that. And going to what both of you are saying about the space of experimentation, I don't think you could have done that with complete impunity as you did in the desert, or it was shot in Tunisia or wherever, but the story was set in the desert, right? And I read somewhere that in the 1960s, when they were maybe re-screening the film, there was a rumor that they were going to add 10 minutes of a gay scene, and the thing is that the room, it was completely unfounded. There was no gay scene film, but the rumor worked because people thought that it's plausible now in the 60s, right? But then if you think about it, we recently had a whole thing where a major studio film agonized over whether having that scene in a very, very mainstream movie, right? Having a gay scene, and in the end sort of said, okay, we can't, maybe we can do it, we can't do it. So I'm not really sure how far we've come in that direction. But it's
Wow.
You could have done it, you could have pushed the envelope, but in Asia.
Ah, right. And I mean, I guess they were working on the fact that, you know, there were several homoerotic kind of moments in Lawrence's novel as well, right? His memoir. But yeah, I want to touch a bit because a lot of the stuff in Lawrence is also about the danger of going native, right? And that's of course a big theme as well when you bring in kind of like marrying locals or having sexual relations with locals. I mean, there was that kind of sense of adventure and freedom in that, but inherent in it was also a kind of danger that the European was going to be absorbed, you know, by locals and become one of them. Yeah, do you have any thoughts on that as well? It seems to. Well, in Lawrence, I mean, there aren't any women in the film, so it's really kind of going native in a different sense, not quite through sexual adventure, but really through kind of cultural cross-dressing and other things.
Yeah. Oh, I was just going to say, I mean, Faris, you mentioned boundaries earlier, and Orientalism really is about those boundaries between, you know, these categories, East and West, civilized, not civilized, and it is about maintaining control over those boundaries. So there's definitely a fear as well of, you know, race kind of bleeding out or kind of become, you know, melding into the native people's kind of customs or race or whatever it is. So it's really about kind of maintaining control of whiteness and you know, that kind of hegemonic identity. So yeah, you're right.
Because empire was all about rule by racial difference, and so, you know, when that difference is kind of threatened, then, you know, that I suppose that's the kind of transgression that Orientalism plays with, that probably also made it so exciting to Europeans.
Yeah, well, he brings in his young assistant, the one who survived, into the army quarters that are meant for just the officers, and everyone is horrified because he's broken all the rules, and he's dressed up in a feminine Arabic way. Let's just put it something like that. You know, he completely stands out from everyone else, and he's got his arm around a boy, an Arab boy. So, yeah.
Right. Yeah, there is. I mean, the happiness of how Peter O'Toole kind of plays Lawrence is also quite something to witness. You know, the way he swishes his robe and things like that. Yeah, and, you know, get that association of the Oriental as essentially a effete, you know, personality compared to the masculine European. So yeah, it's also about a certain kind of European masculinity as well. Let's talk a bit on the politics of production. We're about to end the conversation soon. How has, you know, the East itself, you know, the places depicted in these films, you know, how have they been complicit in the construction of the Orientalist image? The Last Emperor, for example, I mean, China was quite involved in production. You know, how self-aware, you know, are they of the dynamics of this participation? Do you think it neutralizes the problem of, you know, kind of Orientalism's relationship to power? Is the hierarchy disturbed to a degree? What are your thoughts?
Okay, I'll go really quickly. I think it doesn't neutralize anything. I mean, it depends on the context of how it was done. And a movie like The Last Emperor was, you know, produced in that epic sort of international, sort of multinational business model. I mean, I don't think you have that much power and how you're going to dictate things culturally when you're signed on to, at that time, a $25 million film. And, you get the permits and you do what you want to do. You may have other thoughts. A film that comes to mind is The River, because, it was done in Calcutta, and as we know, Sandeep Ray was very, worked on the film or advised on the film or something. It was very hopeful that this would be a certain kind of film. So I'm going to just read 2 lines from his autobiography when he went to meet Renoir, right? I was looking forward with real eagerness to the prospect of a great director tackling the Indian scene. It was therefore an acute disappointment to hear Renoir declare that The River was being made expressly for an American audience and that it contained only one Indian character, a servant in a European household. So he was clearly disappointed, but it doesn't mean because there's some kind of a collaboration that you can actually do anything about it, that you have agency, right? I don't think it works like that. I don't think it neutralizes anything.
Yeah, I agree. Both on the production side and the reception side. In terms of production, when you have a co-production, I guess The Last Emperor is an example where China, was involved in Hiroshima Mon Amour, which is a French and Japanese co-production. It's really a French film, and the perspective is, the screenwriter. It's still. I don't feel like we're really getting a Japanese perspective on that relationship, really, and that's just from the side of production. In terms of reception, I'm not sure how aware audiences are, or whether it makes a difference if there was some form of kind of self or auto exoticizing involved. Audiences still perceive what they see on the screen, and as Sandeep was explaining, we don't necessarily get a lot of translation of that input in these films, at least. We don't really see I don't think I can see how the imperialist gaze has kind of been subverted in many instances. There might be a couple of things that we can point to, but otherwise they're predominantly from the filmmaker's perspective, which is
right.
We're looking at them because they're great examples of Orientalism. They're interesting for lots of different ways. Yeah, I don't think they offer us another way of looking at them, really, besides that dominant one. But I might just be, that's how I see it.
And Bertolucci called The Last Emperor an Italian film, and one of his more Italian films, right? And when I was watching it, I was reminded of Puccini's opera Turandot, that was also kind of set in this kind of courtly imperial Chinese setting. And so it felt like Bertolucci was also participating in a very Italian tradition of exoticizing China, and kind of imperial China as a kind of stage set. So despite the co-production, it was a European film. Let's talk about reception. So Hiroshima Mon Amour did very badly in Japan. How were the other films received, do you think?
The King and I is banned in Thailand, right?
Yeah.
And how could they think that it wouldn't be banned? So it would make you think that they were just not interested in the Asian market. It was basically a Hollywood musical spectacle. They just had no interest in kind of a market outside of Hollywood.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it's also, I mean, the references to kind of American politics. I mean, you've got Uncle Tom's Cabin and the writing of the letters to Lincoln. I mean, it's really about the Americans trying to find themselves in Asia, in Siam. So it really was speaking almost directly to a very American audience. So we have kind of with 7:40. We can start taking questions now from the audience. I don't know. There don't seem to be any questions coming in yet. In the meantime, are there any kind of interesting reactions to the film that you wanted to discuss while we wait for any audience members to? Yeah. Olivia, were you going to say something?
I guess I'm just interested in the grouping of the films, because I mean, I've thought about them individually, for different reasons. So, I've taught Shanghai Express in a course on spectatorship, so on how people kind of receive that film. I've looked at Hiroshima Mon Amour from a different perspective, but just kind of looking at them as a group, I find really interesting, and to think about whether, and they span quite a number of decades as well. So whether we think about Orientalism as a historical genre, like that you can say, was present at a certain time, or whether there are still can we call certain films that still Orientalist, as part of an Orientalist genre, or is it, historically circumscribed? I guess I'm wondering. I'm really thinking about them as a group, because I've never really thought about them as a group before. And there are certainly films now that you can see, that's in yellowface and that's kind of that's not cool. Or there are other things that you can point to that you can't sort of really do now or can't receive in that way. But I don't know are we talking about a historical group of films here? Or that's a question for you guys rather than, I guess if no one's asking us questions, I might ask questions of you too.
That's an interesting question, because that also kind of brings in the question of whether they're also engaging with the politics of their time, and that kind of makes them a product of a certain prevailing, social and political attitude towards Asia, in this kind of like long mid-20th century moment, and does that make films talking about Asia today, depicting Asia today different, because supposedly we're more enlightened, and so those things are no longer acceptable. I mean, yeah. We have a question here. TJ Colanto asks, hello, thank you for the lovely talk. I wanted to ask, I'm curious about your take on Yoshiko Kawashima, the cross-dressing character in The Last Emperor, especially in relation to queerness. Oh yeah, and why Bertolucci felt it was necessary to include this. Thank you. So she's the espionage, the spy who dresses up as a pilot and is really cool. Yeah, Olivia or Sandeep, if you have any thoughts on this character.
Not specifically on this character or Bertolucci's motivations, but the figure of the kind of cross-dressing, or the cross-dressing figure, or the transsexual is often used as a trope to signify kind of moving across boundaries, I think, in a way. So spying, espionage, those kind of things are associated with historically the cross-dressing figure, because they're seen in this very shorthand way to cross sides. I think that's how they're used, but I don't know specifically about this character. In terms of queerness, yeah, that might be just taking some liberties, I think, with the kind of, I don't know, the being in a European film. I don't know whether it was another form of exoticizing or something, but I don't have any information specifically on that character.
Right. Yeah. Oh wait, no other questions. Okay. Yeah.
So let me. So no, I was go on, please, Faris.
No. I didn't have anything. Fully formed to say. You were going to say something.
I wasn't. I was going to just talk about something else.
Please.
Okay, so I was just saying, because I'm going back to Olivia's question about, is this a historical category, and are we post-Orientalist in the filmmaking world? So I think what might separate these films apart is these are famous films. These are the greatest films of all time, right? These films all rank in the top 50, 100, 10, whatever list. Okay. And we're saying that, look, there's reasons why these films are problematic, but I mean, there's still and will forever be, all kinds of films that will have a lot of problems. So I guess the hope is that you wouldn't want to reward a film with 10 Academy Awards not today if it was fundamentally so problematic. People would talk about it today. And maybe, this was a time when, people weren't talking about it. Having said that, I have to confess that when I was watching the films, I really liked most of the films, and I was really immersed in some of the spectacles, some of the productions, even the Uncle Tom's Cabin production that they put up in King and I was in. It's just so watchable, right? And then I have to tell myself, hey, film theory, critique, Orientalism seminar coming up. Snap out of it, right? So there's a reason why these films have stood the test of time, and it would be unfortunate if we just cancel them. I would never want that to happen. Maybe this is the best use of these films today.
Right. Oh, are we allowed to enjoy these films despite their problematic, representations? That's a big issue. What's ethical consumption of certain kinds of media. But you're right. There are kind of formally, stylistically, these are, some of them are they're really highly accomplished, and there's a reason why they've been so canonized.
I guess returning to the self kind of orientalizing, I think you phrase it more positively for us as kind of having collaborative input into the films. But I'm thinking of examples, some of the fifth generation Chinese films, which are really all about self-orientalizing. You've got directors like Zhang Yimou, really just putting the country on display, having a female character stand in for the nation, completely kind of battered, abused sort of representation of the woman, the Asian kind of woman. And it's so beautiful, on its surface, it's just made to be so kind of appealing that international audiences love it, but I don't know, maybe it's different for Chinese audiences. So maybe we're watching it from a perspective of either film scholars or international film scholars. I don't know, maybe it's going to be received very differently outside of that.
That reminds me of Kurosawa's films. Kurosawa was making these samurai epics because he knew this is what the international film circuit wanted, and they ate it up, but they weren't particularly kind of popular back home in Japan. So I think the kind of the what the film market demands internationally also kind of is a force that exerts a certain influence on these creative decisions, that and we end up with these lavish self-orientalizing films.
But we do critique. I think people critique national cinema also, very strongly, and they say, "Oh, come on, you're just sensationalizing the war, or you're completely wrong." Kind of major films are, put to task, as people critique foreigners making film about Asia too. I think we don't have to separate the criticism or the critical look at the films necessarily by who's made it. On one level, it's always there. You could always do that, and
you're an expert on propaganda films, so there's a lot of romanticization and distortion in locally produced films for a domestic market as well. So it's not just the big bad kind of international film circuit or Euro-American circuits. There's a perniciousness to cinema distorting historical accounts of Asian societies as well. I had a thought, and I forgot about it actually.
Yeah, it's interesting to see the films that countries pick as their entry for the Oscars. It's a very political thing, right? Right.
Yeah.
And that's when these discussions of, okay, you're picking this film because you think the West is going to like it, that and could win an award, at Cannes, or could be nominated for Best Picture, but you know very well it's not working very well here, or people here think differently of it, right? So there is still an overarching sense of what the white gaze still wants to gaze at, even for films that might be produced indigenously. I don't think it's completely devoid the film scene of that.
Right. Yeah. And what's there's still a premium placed on certain Academy of Motion Picture standard of expectation of what makes a good foreign film. I mean, the category of best foreign film, right, already says a lot about how the Euro-American film world sees cinema produced outside the West. Foreign films are a kind of specialized category or genre on their own. Let's see. I'm thinking about, a lot of these films are also, set in conflict zones, and they're kind of like war films. Do you feel like, does that have anything to do with a kind of post-war moment as well? I mean, with The Last Emperor, The King and I mean, was that also helping to shape kind of European attitudes towards Asia? And was that also contributing to the popularity of these films? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think definitely with Hiroshima Mon Amour, that was the, setting out to produce a kind of an anti-war film, and sort of reshaping post-war attitudes. It was definitely couched in that way, and every time you frame something like that as a romance or a love story, then it's about that kind of reconciliation, or coming to a new kind of understanding about someone, and therefore that, call me Hiroshima, or call me Navarre, then they're literally standing in for their nation. So yeah, in some ways, I think now though there's so many, we talk about kind of a proliferation of representation, and that there are filmmakers making films now from different perspectives. Before, what we were seeing is we didn't know a lot about the Orient or the desert, or what those places were like, so we really had to rely on those filmmakers' representations or perceptions of that. So I think things are changing now because we just have more examples of things, and we know more about those countries without needing to be educated about them through film in that way.
Right. Thank you. We have a question. Can you comment on the romantic relationship of Anna and the King? The intimations of romance in this musical are parental more than anything, but this changes in the Jodie Foster 90s movie. So this is not The King and I, but a later production from the 90s, Anna and the King. Any comments on that sort of strange dynamic between Anna Leonowens and Mongkut, and how it's depicted?
I haven't seen the Jodie Foster film. I'm going to assume that in the Jodie Foster film, from this comment, that something happens between the King and Anna. And I mean, who knows if, historically speaking, if anything ever happened. But, we talk, as far as storytelling goes, the time that this film was made, the version that we saw for this festival, you couldn't push the envelope beyond parental, which is a very nice word, right? You just couldn't push the envelope. You could just hint at it, and that's it. But maybe in the 90s, people said, hey, we could do other things with it. We could actually, illustrate the question that's on everyone else's mind. But that's just storytelling. I don't know if there's any, historical accuracy to it, and I don't think we'll ever know.
Right. Yeah, and a lot of these films were also consumed in colonial capitals, right? Like London, Paris, and at the same time in colonies like Singapore. So The King and I premiered at the Odeon, and a lot of British officer wives sort of attended it, and it was a whole fashion gala with a biscuit eating contest, apparently. So much about these films. And their kind of aesthetic excess also fed into this, I mean, the festivity of cinema going as an experience was kind of what these movies were part of as well. I mean, I'm thinking also of how Lawrence of Arabia starts, right? You've got an overture, and then the at the AFA screening, they had curtains kind of open up. So really, they were part of also an era of cinema culture where picture palaces kind of turned watching films into a really elevated experience too. So yeah, just kind of thinking about it's not just the film, but really the context of cinema going that they were part of, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the 50s still was reeling from colonial nostalgia, especially in parts of Southeast Asia because of the Japanese occupation. The sort of excesses of the British before that, almost got obscured by the Japanese occupation, right? What happened in right then. And so both these David Lean films, Lawrence of Arabia and later The Bridge on the River Kwai, they're both about, okay, we've kind of lost the empire, but we were the morally good guys, is what they're trying to push, because there's a future with Asia. There's a future of sort of winning people over, of saying, you ought to side with us because the world was sort of tipping this way and that way at the time. And so I think it all works. So like both of you mentioned, it really a lot of these films, more so than talking about the 1915s or 1860, speak to the time at which the film was made, right?
Right. What do you think about films that have been accused of being Orientalist today? I mean, there's also this idea. A lot of Orientalism also hinges on accuracy of representation. So a lot of Orientalist writers are saying that I was there and I witnessed these things, so believe me, this definitely happened. And right now, I don't know. I feel like there's a kind of perversity in how we're clamoring for perfect accuracy. So there was that new Mulan remake that was supposed to kind of be super accurate, and it didn't resonate as much as the 90s Mulan, which was speaking more to a very distinct Chinese American contemporary experience. So I mean, what do you think of that? I mean, like right now we're kind of circulating back to this idea that everything has to be accurate, and in an ironic way, that really was the problem with Orientalism, right? The promise of accuracy.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know if they did promise accuracy. I think they promised a fantasy. Like they didn't promise. They gave us a fantasy, and maybe when it's too accurate, it doesn't have that appeal anymore. Like you're not drawn to it or have the same desire. I mean, I'm not a historian, but I do enjoy the films that are escapist, and I think a lot of those times it was an escape to Asia and the fantasy of promising some otherworldly place that people didn't know much about. You couldn't get there yourself. You had to like there were these long train journeys or long ship journeys or whatever to get there. It's very different now. So maybe what we are craving actually is more fantasy rather than the kind of reality of it all.
Right.
Who wants to see the war as it was and all these people dying or whatever it is? You actually want to see the other side, these imaginary romances or whatever it is. Yeah, I think that's what is appealing to a lot of the films.
Which doesn't, I think, diminish the kind of the problem of these depictions, right? Because because they still do shape perceptions in very real ways. I mean, I'm thinking about Crazy Rich Asians and how a lot of responses to criticism about it being inaccurate were, people saying, well, it's not meant to be a documentary, it's a fictional representation, so don't kick up too much of a fuss about it. But at the same time, I mean, I think we do have to be kind of attentive to how these misrepresentations do have a very real impact as well in shaping how people think about certain places. Yeah. So we've run out of time. It's 8 o'clock. Thank you very much. Before I hand time back to Natalie, I'll just like to, talk a little bit about the Orienting Paradise screenings, right? So all the films in the program are running at the Oldham Theatre until 29th of April. And this weekend, you can catch The Last Emperor by Bernardo Bertolucci, Black Narcissus by Emmerich and Pressburger, Hiroshima Mon Amour by Alan Rene, and a double bill of Sans Soleil and Sunday in Peking by Chris Marker. For more ticketing info, please visit the Asian Film Archives website. Thank you very much. Natalie,
Thank you,
please.
everyone, for joining us today for this panel discussion. And thank you, Faris, also for sharing about the film screenings that are coming up this weekend. And also for our panelists, Olivia and Sandeep. It was really fascinating to hear about how you were rethinking the films in our program and not taking Orientalism wholesale or like as a stable category, but really kind of poking holes in it and reorienting perhaps our audience to see different ways of how we can view Orientalism and if it is even a relevant term that we can use today. So thank you everyone for joining us, and see you at the cinema. Bye-bye.